The rain hammered against the windows of the military briefing room like bullets against armor, each drop carrying the weight of unspoken memories. Captain Sarah Martinez sat rigid in her chair, her scarred hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared at the empty podium where General Harrison would soon stand. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled officers, but none of their expressions were as hard as the one etched permanently into Sarah's features. She had been avoiding this moment for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that she was counting. The nightmares had done that for her, marking time with precision that no clock could match. Every dawn brought with it the echo of rotor blades and the acrid smell of smoke that no amount of scrubbing could wash from her memory. Every sunset painted the sky the same crimson shade as the blood that had soaked through her uniform that day in Kandahar. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, stealing glances at Sarah when they thought she wasn't looking. Word traveled fast in military circles, and everyone knew why she was here. The woman who had once been the most decorated helicopter pilot in her squadron, the one they called Specter 6, with a mixture of awe and reverence, now sat among them like a ghost of her former self. Major Thompson, her former wingman, caught her eye from across the room and offered a tentative smile. Sarah looked away immediately, unable to bear the concern in his expression. He had been there that day, flying behind her as they approached what intelligence had assured them was a routine extraction. He had heard her voice over the radio, calm and controlled even as everything went to hell. He had watched her aircraft spiral down through the smoke, and flames had circled overhead helplessly as she fought to save the lives of everyone aboard. The door at the back of the room opened with a sharp crack that made several officers jump. General Harrison entered with his characteristic purposeful stride, his uniform pressed to perfection and his silver hair gleaming under the harsh lights. He was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, his weathered face telling the story of 30 years spent in service to his country. But as his eyes swept across the room and settled on Sarah, something flickered in his expression that might have been regret. Behind him walked Colonel Rebecca Foster, the base's chief medical officer and Sarah's former therapist. Her presence sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Dr. Foster had been the one to clear her for duty after the mandatory psychological evaluation, the one who had declared her fit to return to active service despite the obvious signs of trauma that still haunted her eyes. It had been a political decision more than a medical one, and they both knew it. General Harrison took his place at the podium, his hands gripping the edges as he surveyed the room. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the continued assault of rain against the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that had guided men through countless battles. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address a matter of critical importance to our ongoing operations in the Middle East theater. His eyes found Sarah's and held them, unflinching. 3 years ago, during Operation Desert Eagle, we suffered casualties that shook this command to its core. Good soldiers died. Others were forever changed. Today, we face a new mission that requires the very best of what this squadron has to offer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming, had dreaded it from the moment she received the summons to attend this briefing. Her fingers unconsciously traced the scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a permanent reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through the cockpit as she fought to keep her burning aircraft in the sky long enough to reach friendly territory. Intelligence reports indicate that a high-value target has been located in a compound approximately 40 kilometers northwest of Bagram. The target is surrounded by hostile forces and situated in terrain that presents significant challenges for conventional extraction methods. The general's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the unspoken implications in every word. This mission requires precision flying under combat conditions. It requires someone with intimate knowledge of the area and the tactical expertise to navigate complex airspace while under fire. The room seemed to shrink around Sarah as the general continued his briefing. Maps appeared on the projection screen, showing satellite imagery of mountains and valleys that she knew as well as the streets of her hometown. She had flown over that terrain dozens of times, had memorized every ridge and valley during her previous deployment. The compound General Harrison highlighted was less than 20 miles from where her world had ended 3 years ago. Captain Martinez. The general's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts like a blade. Your experience in this theater of operations makes you the natural choice to lead this mission. Your call sign, Specter 6, is known throughout the region. Both our allies and our enemies respect what it represents. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could taste the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. The faces around her blurred as memories crashed over her like waves against a crumbling seawall. She was back in the cockpit of her UH-60 Black Hawk, the familiar weight of her helmet and the comfort of the controls beneath her hands. The radio crackled with chatter from her co-pilot, Lieutenant Danny Reeves, barely 23 years old and eager to prove himself. In the back, 6 Special Forces operators checked their weapons and reviewed their mission briefing one final time. It was supposed to be simple. Fly in, extract a wounded intelligence officer, fly out. Routine. The first indication that something was wrong came from the advanced scout team on the ground. Their voices, usually calm and professional, carried an edge of urgency that made Sarah's skin crawl. Specter 6, be advised we have movement in the hills surrounding the LZ. Count at least 20 hostiles with RPGs and heavy machine guns. Recommend abort and Vector to alternate extraction site. But the intelligence officer they were meant to extract was bleeding out, and the alternate site was 40 minutes away through hostile territory. Sarah had made the decision in a heartbeat, her voice steady over the radio. Negative, ground team. Specter 6 is coming in hot. Mark the LZ and prepare for immediate extraction. What followed was a textbook approach under fire. Sarah had woven her aircraft through a maze of incoming rounds, using every piece of cover the terrain offered while her door gunners laid down suppressing fire. The extraction had gone perfectly for exactly 37 seconds. Then the world exploded in fire and shrapnel as a rocket-propelled grenade found its mark. Captain Martinez. General Harrison's voice jerked her back to the present, and Sarah realized she had been gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Do you accept this assignment? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Sarah could feel the weight of expectation, the needs of the mission, the trust that her superiors were placing in her despite everything that had happened. She could also feel the cold touch of terror that had lived in her chest for 3 years, the certainty that if she climbed into another helicopter, she would never come home. But beneath the fear was something else, something that had been buried under layers of guilt and trauma, but had never quite died. It was the part of her that had earned the call sign Specter 6 in the first place, the part that had guided her through dozens of successful missions before that terrible day, the part that had somehow managed to keep her burning aircraft in the sky long enough to save the lives of everyone aboard, even as her own world fell apart around her. I need to know the full mission parameters, Sarah heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. Rules of engagement, support assets, extraction timeline. General Harrison's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah thought she caught a glimpse of something that might have been approval. Classified until you accept the assignment, Captain. But I can tell you that failure is not an option. The target has information vital to national security, and this may be our only opportunity to extract him safely. The rain continued its relentless assault against the windows, and Sarah found herself thinking of Danny Reeves. The young co-pilot had died in her arms as they waited for the rescue team to reach their crash site. His last words a promise to his fiancée that he would make it home for their wedding. She had carried the weight of his death for 3 years, along with the knowledge that her decision to proceed with the extraction had put him and everyone else at risk. But she also remembered the intelligence officer they had saved that day, the information he carried that had prevented a terrorist attack on a civilian marketplace in Kabul. 43 lives had been spared because Sarah had chosen to fly into hell and bring one man home. The mathematics of war were never simple, never clean, but sometimes the choice between action and inaction was the only choice that mattered. The mission designation is Operation Phantom Recovery, General Harrison continued, sensing her wavering resolve. The target is Colonel James Murphy, captured during a reconnaissance mission 6 days ago. Intelligence suggests he has information about planned attacks on coalition forces that could save hundreds of lives. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew James Murphy, had flown with him on several occasions during her previous deployment. He was a good soldier and a better man with a wife and 2 young daughters waiting for him back in Colorado. The thought of him in enemy hands, facing interrogation and, worse, stirred something fierce in her chest. "What's the timeline?" she asked, already knowing she was going to accept. 18 hours, the general replied. Murphy's location was compromised during his capture. Intelligence estimates that enemy forces will begin moving him to a more secure location within the next 24 hours. After that, we may never find him again. The room fell silent except for the rain and the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the accumulated burden of every mission she had flown, every life she had saved, every friend she had lost. The call sign Specter 6 had been earned through blood and sacrifice, through moments of terror and triumph that had forged her into one of the finest pilots in the Air Force. But it had also cost her everything. Her marriage had ended 6 months after the crash, her husband unable to cope with the nightmares, and the emotional distance that had grown between them like a cancer. Her relationship with her family had suffered as she withdrew into herself, unable to explain the darkness that had taken root in her soul. She had lost friends who couldn't understand why she wouldn't talk about what had happened, why she flinched at loud noises, and couldn't bear to be in crowded spaces. The woman who had once been fearless in the face of enemy fire now struggled to drive to the grocery store without breaking into a cold sweat. The pilot who had earned medals for valor under fire couldn't sleep through the night without medication. The leader who had inspired confidence in her subordinates now questioned every decision, second-guessing herself until paralysis set in. Yet here she was, being asked to step back into the role that had defined her, to take on the responsibility for other lives that she wasn't sure she could bear again. The rational part of her mind screamed that she wasn't ready, that the risk was too great, that she would only fail again and drag others down with her. But somewhere deeper in the part of her soul that had never stopped being a soldier, she heard a different voice. It was Danny's voice, steady and calm as it had been in those final moments before the crash. "Specter 6, you've got this. You've always got this." Sarah stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. Every eye was upon her, waiting for her decision, and she could feel the weight of their expectation like a physical presence. General Harrison watched her with an expression that revealed nothing, while Colonel Foster's face showed the concern of someone who understood exactly what was being asked. "I'll need a full briefing on enemy capabilities and disposition," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that had once made her the most respected pilot in the squadron. "I'll also need to personally select my crew and review all available intelligence on the target location." General Harrison nodded slowly. "Granted. The briefing will commence at 0600 hours tomorrow. You'll have access to all relevant classified materials and the pick of available personnel." "One more thing," Sarah said, her hand moving unconsciously to the scar on her face. "I want it understood that I'm accepting this mission not because I believe I'm the best choice, but because Colonel Murphy deserves to come home. If my presence on this operation puts anyone at unnecessary risk, I expect to be relieved immediately." The general's expression softened slightly, and for a moment the hardened military commander gave way to the man beneath. "Captain, the reason you're the best choice for this mission has nothing to do with your flying skills, though they remain exceptional. It's because you understand the cost of failure better than anyone else in this room. That understanding doesn't make you weak, it makes you careful. And careful pilots bring people home." As the meeting dispersed and officers filed out of the room, Sarah remained standing at attention until only she and General Harrison remained. The rain had finally begun to ease, and thin shafts of afternoon sunlight filtered through the clouds to paint golden patterns on the floor. "Sir," Sarah said finally, "I need you to understand something. I'm not the same pilot I was 3 years ago. The crash changed me in ways that I'm still trying to understand. I can't guarantee that I won't freeze up when the shooting starts, and I can't promise that my judgment won't be compromised by what happened before." General Harrison studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Captain, do you know why we called you Specter 6? Because I could get in and out of places other pilots couldn't," Sarah replied automatically. "No," the general said quietly. "We called you Specter 6 because you were like a ghost on the battlefield. You appeared when people needed you most, saved lives that everyone else had written off, and then vanished back into the night. The crash didn't change that, Sarah. It just made the cost more real to you. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. James Murphy has been a ghost for 6 days now. Tomorrow, he needs another ghost to bring him home. The question isn't whether you're the same pilot you were before the crash. The question is whether you're ready to be Specter 6 one more time. As the general left the room, Sarah found herself alone with the memories and the ghosts that had haunted her for 3 years. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, but inside her mind, the turbulence was just beginning. In 18 hours, she would climb into the cockpit of another helicopter and trust her life and the lives of others to skills she wasn't sure she still possessed. But James Murphy was waiting in the darkness, and Specter 6 had never left a soldier behind. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and machine oil, familiar scents that should have been comforting, but instead made Sarah's stomach churn as she walked toward the aircraft that would carry her back into hell. The UH-60 Black Hawk sat under the harsh glare of work lights, its dark metal skin reflecting the shadows of the maintenance crew as they performed final checks on every system. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rodriguez looked up from the engine compartment as she approached, his weathered face breaking into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Rodriguez said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Specter 6 herself. Heard you were back in the game." Sarah managed a weak smile. Rodriguez had been her crew chief during her first deployment, the steady presence who had kept her aircraft flying through some of the worst conditions imaginable. If anyone understood what this mission meant to her, it was him. The fact that he had volunteered for the assignment despite knowing her history spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. "How's she looking, Chief?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the aircraft's armored hull. The metal was cool under her palm, solid and reassuring despite the memories it stirred. "Like a beauty queen with teeth," Rodriguez replied. "New engines, upgraded avionics, and enough armor plating to stop anything short of a direct hit from a tank round. She's not the same bird you flew before, Captain, but she's ready for whatever hell we're flying into." The reference to her previous aircraft hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah had learned that morning that the wreckage of her old Black Hawk was still lying in a valley somewhere in Afghanistan, too damaged and too deep in enemy territory to recover. It had become a monument to failure in her mind, a twisted metal grave marker for the part of herself that had died that day along with Danny Reeves. "Who else is on the crew?" Sarah asked, forcing herself to focus on the present. "You've got Sergeant First Class Amy Chun as your door gunner," Rodriguez said, jerking his thumb toward a compact Asian woman who was methodically cleaning a machine gun on the far side of the hangar. "Best shot I've ever seen, and she's got nerves like steel cables. Your co-pilot is Captain Mike Torres, fresh out of advanced training, but with combat experience from 2 tours in Iraq." Sarah nodded, studying the faces of the people who would trust their lives to her judgment. Chin looked up from her weapon and offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, her expression professional and focused. Torres was younger than Danny had been, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of her deceased co-pilot. The similarities weren't lost on her, and Sarah wondered if General Harrison had chosen the crew composition deliberately. Surrounding her with capable, professional soldiers who resembled the team she had lost might be intended as therapy or torture. She wasn't sure which. Captain Torres approached with his flight gear slung over his shoulder, his posture confident despite the tension that radiated from every line of his body. Word of the mission's danger had spread through the squadron, and everyone knew that flying into the mountains to extract a prisoner was essentially a suicide run with slightly better odds. "Captain Martinez," Torres said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to be flying with you, ma'am. I've read about your service record, and I know we're in good hands." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze. "The honor's mine, Captain, but I want you to understand something before we get in the air. If at any point during this mission you feel that my judgment is compromised or that I'm putting the crew at unnecessary risk, you have my permission to take control of the aircraft. No questions asked." Torres's expression shifted to one of confusion and concern. "Ma'am, I don't think it's not a request," Sarah interrupted. "It's an order. 3 years ago, I made a decision that cost good people their lives. I won't let that happen again because I was too proud or too stubborn to admit I wasn't fit for command." An uncomfortable silence settled over the hangar as her words echoed off the concrete walls. Rodriguez had stopped his maintenance work and was watching her with an expression of deep concern, while Chun had paused in cleaning her weapon to listen. Sarah realized that her little speech had probably done more to undermine her crew's confidence than any enemy fire could. "With respect, ma'am," Torres said quietly, "I've read the after-action reports from your last mission. You saved 6 lives that day, including the intelligence officer whose information prevented a terrorist attack. The loss of Lieutenant Reeves was tragic, but it wasn't the result of poor judgment or cowardice. It was the cost of doing something that needed to be done." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as the young captain's words hit home. The official reports had been kind to her, had painted her as a hero who had sacrificed everything to save others. But the reports hadn't captured the moment of hesitation before she decided to fly into the landing zone, the split second of doubt that might have cost Danny his life. They hadn't documented the nightmares that followed, the way she woke up every morning for months wondering if she could have done something different. Begging the captain's pardon, Rodriguez interjected, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the military. "But I was monitoring radio traffic that day. I heard every word that was said, every decision that was made. You flew through hell to save people, and you brought that bird down as gentle as a feather considering half the tail rotor was missing. Lieutenant Reeves knew the risks when he signed up for this job, just like we all do. Blaming yourself for his death dishonors his sacrifice." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing with them a rush of emotion she had been suppressing for years. Rodriguez was right, of course. Danny had known the dangers, had volunteered for the mission just as she had. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in her heart were 2 very different things. "The intelligence briefing starts in 30 minutes, she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "I suggest we all review the mission parameters one more time before we go in." The briefing room was smaller than the one where General Harrison had made his presentation, with maps covering every available wall surface and a large table dominated by satellite photographs and tactical overlays. Colonel Foster was already present when Sarah arrived, her medical bag and field kit neatly arranged on a side table. The presence of a trauma surgeon on what was supposed to be a simple extraction mission spoke volumes about the expected level of danger. Major Thompson entered a few minutes later, his expression grim as he took his place at the table. As the mission's air support coordinator, he would be responsible for managing the complex dance of helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground forces that would be required to give Sarah's team any chance of success. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison said as he entered the room, "what you're about to see and hear is classified at the highest levels. The information in this briefing does not leave this room under any circumstances." The lights dimmed, and a projection screen came to life with high-resolution satellite imagery of rugged mountain terrain. The compound where Colonel Murphy was being held looked like something from a medieval fortress, with high stone walls and guard towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the surrounding approaches. "Intelligence indicates that Murphy is being held in the central building of this compound," General Harrison continued, using a laser pointer to highlight specific structures. "Guard strength is estimated at between 30 and 50 hostiles, armed with everything from small arms to rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns." Sarah studied the imagery with a pilot's eye, noting the narrow valleys and steep ridgelines that would funnel her approach into predictable corridors. The enemy would know exactly where she was coming from and would have plenty of time to prepare a warm reception. "The extraction window is extremely narrow," the general continued. "Intelligence suggests that Murphy will be moved to a more secure location at first light, approximately 6 hours from now. That gives us one chance to get him out." "What about air support?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Limited," Major Thompson replied. "We'll have 2 Apache gunships providing close air support, but they'll be operating at extreme range. Fuel considerations mean they can only stay on station for 20 minutes maximum." 20 minutes. Sarah had participated in missions where the extraction had taken longer than that just to get the wounded loaded onto the aircraft. If anything went wrong, if they encountered unexpected resistance or mechanical problems, they would be on their own in the middle of enemy territory. "Ground support?" Torres asked. "None," General Harrison replied bluntly. "This is a black operation. If you're captured or killed, the government will deny any knowledge of the mission." You'll be listed as missing in action during a routine training exercise. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a dangerous mission. It was a suicide run with plausible deniability built in. Sarah found herself thinking of her parents, who still didn't fully understand why their daughter had withdrawn from them after the crash. If she died tonight, they would never know the truth about how or why it happened. Captain Martinez, Colonel Foster spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but professional. Are you sure you're ready for this? It's not too late to hand the mission over to another pilot. Sarah looked around the table at the faces of the people who would depend on her judgment in the hours to come. Torres was young and eager, reminded her so much of Danny that it hurt to look at him. Rodriguez had decades of experience, but was trusting her to make the decisions that would keep them all alive. Chun was a professional soldier who deserved a leader who wouldn't freeze up when the shooting started. I'm ready, Sarah said, surprised to find that she meant it. The fear was still there, coiled in her chest like a living thing, but it was accompanied by something else now. It was the cold, professional calm that had carried her through dozens of combat missions, the ability to compartmentalize fear and focus on the task at hand that had earned her the call sign Specter 6. General Harrison nodded approvingly. Mission launch is in 4 hours. Use the time to rest, check your equipment, and prepare mentally for what's ahead. Remember, failure is not an option. Murphy has information that could save hundreds of lives, and this may be our only chance to get him back. As the briefing broke up and people began filing out of the room, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Foster. The medical officer studied her with a clinical gaze that had become familiar during the long months of therapy following the crash. You know, Dr. Foster said quietly, when I cleared you for active duty 6 months ago, I had serious doubts about whether you were truly ready. Your test scores were perfect, your physical condition was excellent, but there was something in your eyes that worried me. Sarah waited, unsure where this conversation was leading. Tonight, for the first time since the crash, I see the old Sarah Martinez. Not the broken woman who's been going through the motions for 3 years, but the pilot who earned a reputation as one of the finest in the Air Force. Foster paused, gathering her medical bag. Murphy is lucky to have you coming for him. As the doctor left the room, Sarah remained seated at the table, staring at the satellite images that showed the place where she might die in a few hours. The compound looked peaceful from space, just another collection of buildings nestled in a mountain valley. But she knew that appearances could be deceiving, that beneath the calm exterior lay a trap designed to kill anyone foolish enough to approach. The next few hours passed in a blur of equipment checks and final preparations. Sarah spent time with each member of her crew, going over emergency procedures and contingency plans until every detail was burned into their memories. She reviewed the approach routes until she could fly them blindfolded, studied the terrain features that might provide cover or concealment, and memorized the radio frequencies they would use to coordinate with their limited air support. As the time for departure approached, Sarah found herself alone in the aircraft, running through the pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. The familiar routine was soothing, each switch and gauge a small piece of control in a situation that was fundamentally chaotic. She had always found peace in the cockpit, in the precise dance of mechanical systems, working in harmony to defy gravity. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the cockpit felt like a tomb, the controls like instruments of judgment rather than tools of salvation. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the accumulated burden of every mission she had flown and every life that had depended on her skills. Rodriguez appeared at the side door, his combat gear making him look like a warrior from some ancient battlefield. Time to go, Captain. Murphy's waiting. Sarah nodded and began the engine start sequence, the familiar whine of turbines spinning up providing a counterpoint to her racing heartbeat. One by one, her crew members took their positions, their faces professional masks that concealed whatever doubts they might be harboring. As the Black Hawk lifted off into the night sky, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of leaving the Earth behind, of entering the three-dimensional world where she had always felt most at home. Below them, the lights of the base fell away, replaced by the vast darkness of the Afghan countryside. Specter 6, this is Tower. The radio crackled in her headset. You are cleared for departure. Good hunting. Tower, Specter 6, Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. Departing base at this time. See you in a few hours. But as they flew into the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. Something deep in her bones told her that not everyone would be coming home from this mission, that before the night was over, she would face the same terrible choices that had haunted her for 3 years. The mountains loomed ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Somewhere in those hills, James Murphy was waiting for rescue, trusting that his brothers and sisters in arms would not abandon him to whatever fate his captors had planned. Sarah adjusted her grip on the controls and settled in for the flight ahead. Whatever happened in the next few hours, whatever price had to be paid, she would not let Murphy down. Specter 6 was flying again, and ghosts, she had learned, were very hard to kill. The flight through the mountain passes was a journey into the heart of darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Sarah kept the Black Hawk low, using the terrain to mask their approach from enemy radar and observation posts. The aircraft moved like a predator through the night, its engines muffled to reduce noise signature as it wove between peaks that rose like ancient sentinels against the star-filled sky. In the cockpit beside her, Captain Torres monitored their navigation systems with the intensity of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. His hands moved constantly over the controls, adjusting their flight path based on real-time intelligence updates that crackled through their encrypted communication system. Behind them, Rodriguez and Chun maintained vigilant watch through night vision equipment, their weapons ready for the first sign of hostile activity. Specter 6, this is Falcon 1. The voice of the lead Apache gunship pilot filled their headsets. We have you on thermal. Recommend descent to Napa of Earth level for final approach. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and dropped the Black Hawk even lower until they were racing through valleys with their rotor disc barely clearing the rocky outcroppings that jutted from the hillsides. It was flying that required absolute precision and nerves of steel, the kind of low-level navigation that had earned her reputation as one of the finest pilots in the squadron. But with each mile that passed beneath their aircraft, Sarah felt the familiar knot of tension growing in her stomach. The terrain was bringing back memories she had fought to suppress, reminding her of another mission 3 years ago when confidence and skill had not been enough to prevent tragedy. The mountains looked different in the darkness, more menacing, as if the very landscape was conspiring against their mission. 2 minutes out from the compound, Torres announced, his voice tight with concentration. All systems green, crew ready for insertion. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see the faint glow of lights ahead, marking the enemy stronghold where Colonel Murphy was being held. The compound sat in a narrow valley like a spider in the center of its web, perfectly positioned to control the surrounding terrain. Approaching it would require flying through a gauntlet of overlapping fields of fire, with no room for error and nowhere to hide if things went wrong. Falcon 1, Specter 6, Sarah transmitted to the Apache gunships. Request immediate suppression of enemy positions on my mark. Roger, Specter 6. We see multiple thermal signatures in the guard towers. Ready to engage on your command. Sarah took a deep breath and felt time slow down around her, the way it always did in the moments before combat. This was the place where training and instinct met reality, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She had been here before, had felt this same mixture of fear and determination that sharpened her senses to razor-edge clarity. The compound rushed toward them out of the darkness, its walls and buildings taking shape like a three-dimensional puzzle that she had to solve in the next 60 seconds. Sarah could see muzzle flashes beginning to twinkle from the guard towers as sentries spotted their approach, could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire over the sound of the rotors. All call signs, Specter 6, she transmitted on the command frequency. Beginning final approach. Falcon flight, you are cleared to engage. The night exploded into violence as the Apache gunships opened fire with their chain guns, sending streams of high-explosive rounds into the guard towers and defensive positions surrounding the compound. The darkness was torn apart by tracer fire and explosions, turning the peaceful valley into a vision of mechanized hell. Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a steep diving turn, using the confusion of the gun runs to mask her approach to the landing zone inside the compound walls. The aircraft shuddered as small arms fire began to impact the armored hull, the distinctive ping of bullets against metal providing a deadly percussion to accompany her flying. Taking fire from a northwest wall, Chen reported from her position at the door gun. Multiple shooters with automatic weapons. Engaging, Rodriguez replied, opening fire with the other door gun to suppress the enemy positions. The sound of the heavy machine guns was deafening inside the aircraft, adding to the cacophony of combat that filled Sarah's headsets. Through the chaos, Sarah spotted their objective, a small courtyard in the center of the compound where intelligence suggested Murphy was being held. The landing zone was barely large enough for the Black Hawk, surrounded by buildings that could hide dozens of enemy fighters. But it was their only option, the only way to get close enough to extract their target. 30 seconds to touchdown, Sarah announced, fighting the controls as wind shear from the surrounding buildings tried to push the aircraft into the walls. Chun, Rodriguez, prepped for fast rope insertion as soon as we're on the ground. The Black Hawk settled toward the courtyard like a falling leaf, Sarah using every ounce of her skill to compensate for the turbulent air and hostile fire. She could see muzzle flashes from windows and doorways, could hear the steady crack of rounds passing close to the aircraft. But her world had narrowed to the space between the rotor disc and the ground, to the precise coordination of collective and cyclic controls that would bring them down safely. Then, just as the landing skids touched stone, everything went to hell. The explosion that tore through the compound came, without warning, a massive detonation that lit up the night sky like a miniature sun. The shockwave hit the Black Hawk just as it was settling onto the ground, lifting the aircraft and slamming it back down with bone-jarring force. Alarms began screaming in the cockpit as systems failed, and warning lights painted the instrument panel in ominous red. Specter 6, Falcon 1. The Apache pilot's voice was tight with urgency. Be advised, we're seeing secondary explosions throughout the compound. It looks like they're destroying evidence. You need to get out of there now. But even as the radio crackled with warnings, Sarah was already fighting to keep the damaged aircraft under control. The tail rotor had taken shrapnel from the explosion, causing a violent yaw that threatened to spin them into the surrounding buildings. Only her years of training and muscle memory kept them from becoming a crater in the compound courtyard. Torres, emergency shutdown on engine number 2, she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. Rodriguez, Chun, get ready to move. We're not staying here long. Through the smoke and debris, Sarah caught sight of movement in one of the buildings that surrounded the courtyard. A figure in desert camouflage was being dragged between two armed men, his hands bound behind his back and a dark hood over his head. Even at a distance and in poor visibility, she recognized the bearing and build of Colonel James Murphy. Target identified, she announced over the radio. Building 3, northwest corner. 2 guards, possibly more inside. Chun and Rodriguez were already moving, dropping fast ropes from the side doors and preparing to assault the building. But as they prepared to leave the relative safety of the aircraft, the compound erupted in gunfire from multiple positions. The enemy had recovered from the initial surprise and was now bringing concentrated fire to bear on the landing zone. We can't stay here, Torres shouted over the noise. The aircraft won't survive another explosion like that. Sarah knew he was right. The Black Hawk was badly damaged, with multiple systems failing and structural damage that made every control input an exercise in faith over physics. But Murphy was less than 100 meters away, so close she could almost reach out and touch him. Leaving now would mean abandoning him to whatever fate his captors had planned, something she had sworn never to do again. Negative, she replied, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. We didn't come this far to leave empty-handed. Rodriguez, Chun, you have 5 minutes to get Murphy and get back here. After that, we won't be able to lift off. The 2 crew members exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation, but they followed orders without question. Within seconds, they had fast roped to the ground and were moving across the courtyard under covering fire from the remaining door gunners on the Apache helicopters. Sarah watched through her night vision equipment as her crew members breached the building where Murphy was being held, their movements precise and professional despite the hostile fire that erupted from surrounding positions. She could see muzzle flashes through the windows as they fought their way through the structure, could hear the distant crack of small arms fire mixing with the closer sounds of combat. But her attention was divided between the rescue operation and the increasingly dire state of her aircraft. Warning alarms continued to sound, indicating failures in multiple critical systems. The damaged tail rotor was causing severe vibrations that threatened to shake the airframe apart, while fuel leaks from damaged lines created a constant fire hazard. Specter 6, this is Falcon 1. The Apache pilot's voice carried a note of desperation. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Our ammunition is running low, and we're going to have to break off soon. Sarah felt the familiar chill of impending disaster, the same sensation she had experienced 3 years ago when everything started to fall apart. The mission was unraveling around her, with too many variables spinning out of control and too few options for recovery. But this time, she was determined not to let fear paralyze her judgment. Falcon 1, maintain covering fire for as long as possible, she transmitted. We're almost done here. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw Rodriguez and Chin emerging from the building with a third figure between them. Colonel Murphy was alive and conscious, though he moved with the stiff, painful gait of someone who had been subjected to interrogation and worse. The sight of him filled Sarah with a surge of determination that cut through the fear and doubt. But as the rescue team began moving across the courtyard toward the aircraft, the enemy response intensified. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, forcing the three figures to take cover behind a concrete barrier while bullets chipped stone fragments around them. They were pinned down, unable to move forward or back, trapped in the killing ground of the compound courtyard. Specter 6, we're taking too much fire. Rodriguez's voice was barely audible over the gunfire. Can't make it to the bird with this much lead flying around. Sarah looked at the situation through the eyes of a combat pilot, analyzing angles and distances with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. The Apache gunships were running low on ammunition and would have to break off soon, leaving her crew stranded in the middle of an enemy stronghold. The Black Hawk was damaged, but still flyable, though each passing minute increased the risk of catastrophic failure. But there was another option, one that made her blood run cold, even as she recognized its necessity. She could use the aircraft itself as a weapon, bringing it close enough to the enemy positions to suppress their fire with rotor wash and the psychological impact of several tons of armed helicopter bearing down on them. It was insanely dangerous, requiring precise flying in damaged aircraft while under fire from multiple positions. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or poor judgment, and she would crash into the building where her crew members were trapped, killing everyone, including the man they had come to rescue. But it was also exactly the kind of impossible maneuver that had earned her the call sign Specter 6, the reputation for appearing when needed most and accomplishing what others couldn't even attempt. Hold your position, she transmitted to her ground team. I'm coming to get you. Sarah lifted the Black Hawk off the landing zone, feeling the damaged aircraft fight her every input as she wrestled it into the air. The tail rotor damage made every movement unpredictable, forcing her to constantly correct for unwanted yaw while maintaining enough control authority to avoid the surrounding buildings. She brought the helicopter in low and fast, using the rotor wash to blow dust and debris across the compound while the door gunners laid down suppressing fire on enemy positions. The psychological impact was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who had been firing from windows and doorways suddenly found themselves facing several tons of armored aircraft that seemed to materialize out of the darkness like an avenging spirit. Now, Sarah commanded, move now while they're suppressed. Rodriguez, Chun, and Murphy broke from cover and ran for the aircraft, their movements hampered by the colonel's injuries but driven by desperate determination. Sarah held the Black Hawk in position despite the continuing gunfire, despite the warning alarms that screamed of imminent system failures, despite the voice in her head that warned this was exactly how Danny Reeves had died. But this time was different. This time, she was ready for the cost, ready to pay whatever price was necessary to bring her people home. As the three figures reached the aircraft and began climbing aboard, Sarah felt a surge of fierce satisfaction that cut through the fear and doubt. They had done it. Against impossible odds, surrounded by enemies, and flying a damaged aircraft, they had rescued Colonel Murphy and were bringing him home. It was the kind of mission that legends were built on, the kind of operation that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. But even as her crew members secured Murphy in the passenger compartment, Sarah knew their ordeal was far from over. The damaged Black Hawk would have to fly through hostile territory for nearly 2 hours before reaching friendly airspace, with enemy fighters likely scrambling to intercept them and mechanical failures becoming increasingly probable with each passing mile. The extraction from the compound was just the beginning. The real test of Specter 6 was yet to come. The flight away from the compound was a nightmare of mechanical failures and hostile pursuit that pushed both aircraft and crew to their absolute limits. Sarah fought the controls of the damaged Black Hawk through mountain passes that seemed to close in around them like the jaws of some enormous predator, while warning alarms created a symphony of impending disaster in the cockpit. Behind her, Colonel Murphy lay strapped to a stretcher that Rodriguez had improvised from emergency medical supplies. The rescued officer was conscious but badly injured, his face bearing the unmistakable marks of interrogation and abuse. Dr. Foster worked over him with professional efficiency, starting in 4-line and administering pain medication while Chun monitored their surroundings for signs of pursuit. "How is he?" Sarah called back without taking her eyes off the terrain ahead. "Dehydrated, multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding," Foster replied tersely. "He needs surgery, but he'll survive if we can get him to a proper medical facility." If they could get him there. The qualifier hung in the air like smoke from a crash site, unspoken but understood by everyone aboard. The Black Hawk was hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid from multiple punctures. The damaged tail rotor was creating vibrations that threatened to shake the airframe apart, and they were still deep in enemy territory with hours of flying ahead of them. "Specter 6, this is Falcon 1. The Apache pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "We're bingo fuel and have to return to base. You're on your own from here." Sarah acknowledged the transmission with professional calm, though the departure of her air support sent a chill down her spine. The two gunships had provided covering fire during the extraction and had helped suppress enemy forces during their escape from the compound. Now the Black Hawk was alone in the darkness, a wounded bird trying to make it home through territory crawling with hostile forces. "Torres, give me a navigation update," Sarah commanded, her hands never stopping their constant dance over the controls as she compensated for the aircraft's increasing instability. "We'll deal with whatever's waiting for us when we get there." The mountains seemed to grow taller and more threatening as they approached the pass, their peaks crowned with snow that gleamed like bone in the moonlight. Sarah kept the Black Hawk as low as possible, using the terrain to mask their radar signature while praying that their engine noise wouldn't alert enemy observation posts to their presence. But as they entered the narrow confines of the pass, it became clear that stealth was no longer an option. Muzzle flashes began twinkling from concealed positions on both sides of the valley, tracer rounds painting deadly arcs through the darkness as hidden gunners opened fire on the wounded aircraft. Taking fire from multiple positions, Chin reported, returning shots with her door gun. "Looks like they were waiting for us." Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been challenging in a healthy aircraft, but were nearly impossible with the damaged flight controls. The helicopter bucked and yawed unpredictably, fighting her inputs as damaged systems struggled to respond to her commands. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in an ominous red glow, while the smell of burning hydraulic fluid began to fill the cabin. "Engine temperature climbing," Torres announced, monitoring the instruments with growing alarm. "We're losing oil pressure on the number 1 engine." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down as crisis focused her mind to laser-sharp clarity. She had been here before, had felt this same convergence of multiple system failures and hostile fire that threatened to overwhelm even the most experienced pilot. But this time, she was ready for it. 3 years of nightmares and self-doubt had prepared her for this moment, had forced her to confront every possible failure scenario until she knew instinctively how to respond. The crash that had haunted her dreams was actually a masterclass in emergency procedures, a brutal education in how to keep flying when everything went wrong at once. "Shutting down engine number 1, she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Switching to single-engine procedures. The Black Hawk shuddered as she reduced power and adjusted her flight profile to compensate for the loss of half their engine power. Single-engine flight in a helicopter was always dangerous, requiring precise control inputs and constant attention to airspeed and altitude. Doing it while under fire and flying through mountain terrain was the aviation equivalent of performing surgery during an earthquake. But Sarah had trained for this, had practiced single-engine approaches until she could fly them in her sleep. The damaged aircraft responded to her touch like a wounded animal, requiring constant coaxing and careful handling to keep it in the air. But it was still flying, still carrying them toward safety 1 mile at a time. How much farther to friendly airspace? She asked, not daring to look away from the terrain ahead. 32 miles, Torres replied. But we're going to be cutting it close on fuel. The leaks are worse than we thought. 32 miles. In a healthy aircraft, it would be less than 20 minutes of flying time. But with a damaged helicopter losing fuel and engine power, it might as well have been 1,000 miles. Sarah did the calculations in her head, balancing fuel consumption against airspeed and altitude, trying to find the precise combination that would stretch their remaining resources far enough to reach salvation. Behind her, Colonel Murphy stirred on his improvised stretcher, his eyes opening to focus on the faces of the people who had risked everything to save him. Despite his injuries and the obvious pain he was enduring, he managed a weak smile when he saw Dr. Foster working over him. "Specter 6, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I knew you'd come. I told them you'd come." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing with them a surge of emotion that she had been holding back since the mission began. Here was validation from the man they had rescued, confirmation that the risk had been worth it, that the price they were paying was justified by the life they had saved. But the moment of emotional release was interrupted by a new alarm in the cockpit, the distinctive warble that indicated an incoming missile. Sarah looked up through the windscreen and saw the telltale smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile climbing toward them from a position on the valley floor. "Missile launch," she announced with professional calm. "Everyone hold on." What followed was a display of flying that would later be studied by military aviators as a textbook example of how to defeat an incoming missile with a damaged aircraft. Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a diving turn that took them below the missile's minimum engagement envelope, using the terrain to break the weapon's guidance lock while simultaneously deploying countermeasures. The missile exploded harmlessly behind them, its warhead filling the night sky with deadly fragments that sparked off the rocks below. But the evasive maneuver had cost them precious altitude and airspeed, forcing Sarah to use more power from their remaining engine to regain lost energy. "Fuel status critical," Torres reported, his voice reflecting the gravity of their situation. "At current consumption rate, we have maybe 10 minutes of flying time remaining." 10 minutes. Sarah looked ahead through the pass and saw nothing but more mountains and more opportunities for enemy fire. They were still miles from friendly territory, still deep in hostile airspace with a damaged aircraft that was slowly dying around them. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. They simply didn't have enough fuel to reach safety. But Sarah had learned something important during her 3 years of nightmares and self-doubt. Sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult, and difficult was something she had been dealing with her entire career. The crash that had ended her last mission had taught her that survival often came down to making choices that seemed impossible until you actually made them. "Chun, Rodriguez," she called back to her crew members. "Jettison everything non-essential. Medical supplies, ammunition, personal gear, anything that isn't bolted down. We need to reduce weight." Her crew moved with practiced efficiency, throwing equipment and supplies out the doors to lighten the aircraft's load. Every pound they discarded meant a few more seconds of flying time, a few hundred more feet toward safety. It wasn't much, but in their current situation, every advantage mattered. As the Black Hawk emerged from the narrow confines of the pass, Sarah caught sight of lights in the distance that marked the forward operating base where they had begun their mission. It was still impossibly far away, a constellation of hope that seemed to mock their desperate situation. But it was there, real and achievable if she could just keep the aircraft in the air for a few more minutes. "Tower, this is Specter 6, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Declaring emergency. Single engine, low fuel battle damage. Request immediate clearance for emergency landing." "Specter 6, Tower," came the immediate reply. "Emergency equipment is rolling. You are cleared for straight-in approach to runway 27. Winds are calm." The runway was still 15 miles away, across terrain that offered no suitable emergency landing sites if the engine failed or the fuel ran out. It would be a race against time and mechanical failure, a test of pilot skill and aircraft endurance that would determine whether they would be heroes or casualties. But as Sarah lined up for the final approach, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the crash 3 years ago. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had done everything possible, that regardless of the outcome, she had given her absolute best effort to complete the mission and bring her people home. The Black Hawk limped toward the runway on fumes, and determination, its damaged rotor system creating a distinctive sound that would forever after remind Sarah of the price of courage. Behind her, Colonel Murphy held Dr. Foster's hand, while Chun and Rodriguez watched their fuel gauges tick steadily toward empty. They were Specter 6, ghosts in the darkness carrying precious cargo toward the light. And ghosts, Sarah had learned, were very hard to kill. The final approach to the runway was a masterpiece of flying under impossible conditions, a testament to skill, determination, and the refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed inevitable. Sarah coaxed every last ounce of performance from the dying Black Hawk, trading altitude for airspeed with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of someone who knew that failure meant death for everyone aboard. "Tower, Specter 6, she transmitted, her voice remaining steady despite the chaos around her. "Final approach, single engine, hydraulics failing. Have medical standing by for a priority casualty." "Roger, Specter 6, came the immediate reply. "Emergency equipment in position. You're clear to land. Good luck." Through the darkness ahead, Sarah could see the lights of the base growing larger, the runway threshold approaching with what seemed like infinite slowness. The Black Hawk was barely maintaining flying speed, its damaged rotor system creating vibrations that threatened to shake the airframe apart with each revolution of the main rotor. Behind her, Colonel Murphy had lost consciousness again, his breathing shallow, and labored as Dr. Foster worked to stabilize his condition with the limited medical supplies remaining after their weight reduction effort. Chun and Rodriguez watched their fuel gauges with the intensity of people watching a countdown to their own execution, knowing that when the needles hit empty, their fate would be decided by gravity and the skill of their pilot. 1 mile, Torres announced. "Engine temperature critical. We're not going to make it to the runway." Sarah looked ahead at the lights that marked safety and salvation, still impossibly distant despite everything they had sacrificed to reach them. The mathematics of their situation were brutal and unforgiving. They were too heavy, too damaged, and too low on fuel to complete a normal approach. In a few moments, the engine would fail completely, and they would become another statistic in the long history of aircraft that had died within sight of home. But Sarah had learned something important during the darkest period of her life, something that the nightmares and guilt had eventually taught her. Sometimes heroism wasn't about succeeding against impossible odds. Sometimes it was about refusing to give up even when success was no longer possible. "Everyone hold on," she announced over the intercom. "We're going to auto-rotate from here." An auto-rotation in a helicopter was the aviation equivalent of a controlled crash, using the aircraft's forward momentum to keep the rotors spinning after engine failure. It required perfect timing, precise control inputs, and more than a little luck to execute successfully under normal conditions. Attempting it in a damaged aircraft at night while carrying wounded passengers was beyond dangerous. It was essentially a form of controlled suicide with a slim chance of survival. But it was their only option. Sarah lowered the collective pitch control to enter the auto-rotation, trading rotor RPM for time and distance as the Black Hawk began its final descent toward the base. The aircraft felt different without engine power, more like a falling rock than a flying machine, but it was still under her control for the moment. The ground rushed up toward them with terrifying speed, the lights of the base becoming individual details rather than a distant glow. Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioned around the runway, their flashing lights creating a kaleidoscope of red and blue that marked the boundary between disaster and salvation. "Flare now," Torres called out, reading the radar altimeter as they approached the critical decision point. Sarah pulled back on the cyclic control and raised the collective, using the aircraft's stored kinetic energy to arrest their descent and cushion the impact with the ground. The Black Hawk shuddered as it hit the runway, bounced once, and then settled onto the concrete with a jarring impact that sent shock waves through the airframe. For a moment, silence filled the cockpit except for the gradually slowing whine of the rotor system as it wound down. Then, the sounds of emergency vehicles reached them, the wail of sirens, and the shouts of rescue personnel as they rushed toward the crashed aircraft. "Everyone okay?" Sarah called out, her hands shaking as adrenaline began to leave her system. "Murphy's unconscious, but stable," Dr. Foster reported. "Rodriguez has a possible concussion. Chen's got some cuts from flying debris." "Torres, I'm good," the co-pilot replied, though his voice was shaky. "That was some flying, Captain. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah sat in her seat for a moment, unable to quite believe that they had survived. 3 years of nightmares and self-doubt had led to this moment. This validation that Specter 6 was more than just a memory from better days. The call sign represented something that couldn't be destroyed by crashes or casualties, something that lived on regardless of the price it demanded. The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and paperwork that seemed surreal after the intensity of combat. Colonel Murphy was rushed to surgery, where Dr. Foster and the base medical team worked to repair the damage inflicted by his captors. The intelligence he provided would indeed save hundreds of lives, justifying every risk they had taken to rescue him. Sarah found herself in General Harrison's office as dawn broke over the base. The morning light streaming through windows that looked out over the runway where their damaged Black Hawk sat, surrounded by investigation teams. The aircraft would never fly again, its airframe too damaged to repair, but it had served its purpose. "Captain," General Harrison said, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who had seen too much war. "I've read the preliminary reports from your crew. What you accomplished last night was nothing short of miraculous." Sarah nodded, but said nothing. She was still processing the mission, still trying to reconcile the success they had achieved with the memories of failure that had haunted her for so long. "The Congressional Medal of Honor has been recommended for your actions," the general continued. "Flying a damaged aircraft into enemy territory, conducting a rescue under fire, and then bringing everyone home safely. It's the kind of heroism that legends are built on." "With respect, sir," Sarah said quietly, "I was just doing my job. Murphy needed help, and we were the ones positioned to provide it." General Harrison studied her with the appraising gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating soldiers and their motivations. "3 years ago, you told me that the crash had changed you, that you weren't sure you could trust your judgment under fire. What changed?" Sarah thought about the question, trying to find words for something that felt more like instinct than conscious decision. "I think I finally understood that being afraid doesn't make you a coward. It just makes you human. The trick is learning to function despite the fear, not trying to eliminate it." The general nodded approvingly. "Danny Reeves would be proud of what you accomplished last night. He died believing in Specter 6, and you proved that his faith was justified." The mention of her deceased co-pilot brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of healing rather than guilt. For the first time since the crash, she could think of Danny without the crushing weight of responsibility for his death. He had been a soldier who understood the risks, just as she was a soldier who accepted the consequences of her choices. "There's something else," General Harrison said, pulling a folder from his desk drawer. "Command is offering you a promotion and a transfer to a training position stateside. You could spend the rest of your career teaching other pilots how to be heroes." Sarah considered the offer, imagining a life of safety and routine, of passing on her skills to the next generation without risking her neck in combat zones. It was appealing in many ways, a chance to contribute without constantly facing the specter of death and failure. But as she thought about it, she realized that Specter 6 wasn't meant for safety. The call sign represented something that thrived in danger, that found purpose in impossible missions, and drew strength from the very challenges that broke lesser pilots. "Thank you, sir," she said finally, "but I think I'll stay where I am. There are more people out there who need help, and Specter 6 has never been one to walk away from a fight." General Harrison smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face and made him look years younger. "I was hoping you'd say that. We're going to need pilots like you for what's coming next." As Sarah left the general's office and walked across the tarmac toward the flight line, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. It was peace, not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of it. She was Specter 6, a ghost in the machine of modern warfare, and ghosts had work to do. The nightmares would probably never go away completely, and the scar on her face would always remind her of the price of courage. But she had learned something important during the darkest period of her life. Heroes weren't people who never fell down. There were people who got back up, who faced their demons, and continued fighting despite the cost. Colonel Murphy survived his surgery and returned to his family in Colorado, carrying with him the knowledge that he owed his life to a pilot who had refused to abandon him. The intelligence he provided led to the disruption of a major terrorist network and saved countless innocent lives. Rodriguez and Chen returned to duty within a week, their injuries minor compared to the satisfaction of completing an impossible mission. Torres requested a permanent transfer to Sarah's crew, citing her as the finest pilot he had ever flown with. And Sarah? She continued flying, continued earning the call sign that had become synonymous with impossible rescues and miraculous survivals. She saved dozens more lives over the years that followed, each mission adding to the legend of Specter 6. But, perhaps more importantly, she had saved herself. The woman who had been broken by guilt and trauma had been reforged in the crucible of combat, emerging stronger and more determined than before. The ghosts that had haunted her dreams had become allies, reminders of the price of heroism and the value of the lives she fought to protect. When people asked her about that night, about the mission that had restored her faith in herself, Sarah would simply smile and say that she had been doing her job. But those who knew her, who had served with Specter 6 and witnessed the miracle she performed, understood the truth. Some people were born to fly. Others learned through practice and dedication. But a rare few, like Sarah Martinez, were destined to become legends. They were the ghosts who appeared when hope was lost, who snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and brought people home against impossible odds. They were Specter 6, and in a world full of darkness, they were the light that never went out. Years later, when Sarah finally did retire from active duty, she was asked to speak at the Air Force Academy about leadership and courage under fire. Standing before a room full of young pilots who looked at her with the same awe she had once reserved for her own heroes, she spoke about the importance of facing your fears rather than running from them. The call sign Specter 6, she told them, isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and flying anyway, about understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Every time you climb into the cockpit, you're making a choice to put others before yourself. That choice doesn't get easier with experience. It just becomes more meaningful. As she looked out at the eager young faces, Sarah saw the future of military aviation, the next generation of pilots who would carry on the tradition of service and sacrifice that defined the profession. Some of them would earn call signs of their own, would become legends in their own right through acts of heroism that hadn't been imagined yet. But they would all understand, as Sarah had learned through pain and triumph, that being a pilot wasn't just about flying. It was about being willing to become a ghost in the machine, a specter that appeared when needed most and disappeared into the darkness when the job was done. The scar on her face had faded with time, but the lessons it represented had only grown stronger. She was Specter 6 forever and always a ghost who had learned to live again.